So where we're going to go in the course, very interestingly, I think now, is at this interesting part in history where the American story intersects with the European story. I've mentioned these two isms that define American foreign policy at the beginning of the 20th century. The first is known as progressive imperialism, this idea that the United States can go abroad as a progressive empire and make things better around the world by almost acting like a policeman. So wherever they see things wrong, particularly in our backyard, the Western Hemisphere, we go in and we try to clean up those messes. And we do so with the confidence that the American way of life is one that will be broadly accepted by all, or if not broadly accepted, at least they'll enjoy the encouragement that comes from having a good policeman in their backyard. The second ism that defines American foreign policy at the beginning of the 20th century is called liberal internationalism. And I mentioned that the main person behind this idea or set of ideas was a man named Woodrow Wilson, who at one time was president of Princeton, went on to become governor of New Jersey, and whose claim to fame as an American president was how he shifts the American foreign policy focus in the 20th century. Oddly enough, what's interesting about Wilson is that when he took on the reins of president, most of his efforts were directed toward changing domestic policy. But he will become known as a major force in American foreign policy history because during his presidency, World War I is taking place in Europe. So what moves Wilson as an individual, as we see in this chapter? Well, it's this optimism driven by his belief in the social gospel. Wilson very much believes that God has placed him in this position as leader of the United States to clean up the mess of world history. Now, what does it mean to clean up the mess of world history? One of the spectacular things about 19th century Victorian Europe was the belief that human beings had finally arrived, if not at a purified state, at the highest state of human history. That customs and norms and manners and all the rest had combined to create a responsible human being who was responsible to his family, responsible to his community, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a great amount of hope in 19th century Europe that man had finally arrived. And then the war happens. And the war sees one great nation taking on another great nation to the devastation of all nations across Europe. So what is produced within the European mindset? This great optimism of the 19th century is then transitions to an amazing pessimism about human nature. So that's what Wilson is encountering in leading the United States eventually into World War I. So an optimistic, progressive United States that believes that it can share its liberal institutions with the world, and a European world that has been made pessimistic by the turning of events at the beginning of the 20th century. So how does this mix, or what does this mix look like? We'll note here an important speech that Wilson will give May 16th of 1916, in which he takes on the question of the European war. And he says a couple things that are very interesting. I think some of them that are very true. He says, America, whether it will or not, has always been a participant in the life of the world. America's always been involved in world history, always been involved in international relations. I think that statement is true. You look back to the American Revolution, you look back to activities in the 17th and 18th and 19th century. The United States didn't exist in a bubble. It wasn't placed outside of this world. Yes, it was distant. There was an ocean between it and most of what was taking place. But it always saw itself as an extension of the old world. Now, the second statement that Wilson makes in this speech is that we must be leaders in the world. And that's where you begin to see a shift in the American foreign policy mindset. If you were to go back to George Washington's farewell address that he gives at the end of the 18th century, he says that America must be just and beneficent to all nations, but really kind of tend to its own business. That the more that it got caught up in the antipathies and the likes and dislikes of the world, the more that it would sell itself over to the problems of other countries. And here Wilson says, no, to be a true America, we must be an America that is leading world affairs. And then he takes up the aggressors of World War I, and he says a very important line. He says, I care not why they are fighting. I just want peace to assume a permanent aspect. Now think about that. You go back to the village with your roommates and you're talking with them and you see that two of them are arguing. Would you walk into that room and you say, I don't care what you're fighting about. I just want peace to happen now. Would they listen to you and then turn themselves over to peace? Well, in all likelihood, probably not. Because when you come across aggressors who are fighting, like the aggressors of World War I, the key question is, well, why are you fighting? What's the cause of your battle, of your war? What is the disagreement? And if you can understand why the disagreement is taking place, perhaps you can mediate a solution between those two parties. But more than likely, one side or the other is going to have to give way to their opposition. Wilson did not believe that this had to be the case. Wilson believed that he had almost like a Christ-like ability to go into a warring situation and take the warring people and have them agree to a peace. So a lot of what's taking place in this chapter is a representation of his personal will, his personal belief system, superimposed upon the American foreign policy structure. And as you'll see at the end of this chapter, no matter how hard he tries, he cannot stop human nature from being human nature. He cannot stop the European aggressors from still having those antagonisms against one another. And those antagonisms, unfortunately and tragically, that are still there after the war paved the way for another world war 10, 15 years down the road. So keep this in mind as you read through this chapter.